This is a lecture I call Hermeneutics 501, meaning that this is a kind of reintroduction to hermeneutics for the graduate level. And I realize that there are other classes in hermeneutics, but at the same time I find myself always talking about hermeneutics and homiletics. At the end of the day, those are the two things that motivate me. And in some ways, Reading Gospels Wisely is basically a hermeneutical book in the sense of a specific how to read, which is what hermeneutics is really about. What is interpretation, how to do it. And so there are a lot of chapters in here that end up dealing with that, if not the whole book in some significant way. But particularly what I want to do is talk about chapter 6 and part of chapter 7 right now in Reading Gospels Wisely, and then say a few more things related to that as well, a couple of different things I want to say related to hermeneutical issues. But first, starting with chapter 6 of Reading Gospels Wisely, the big point of that is that I give you that chart, that 3 avenues chart that you can see there. And the point is more than the Gospels. It's, in fact, how to read anything at the end of the day, but particularly how to read all of Holy Scripture. And my big point of the 3 avenues of reading a canonical text is that there are many different ways of reading. There are many different ways of approaching, all of which have great benefit. So I categorize them into these 3 columns pictorially. We can call them behind the text, we can call them in the text, and then in front of the text. Behind the text includes really most of the tools that develop in the modern period of a more historical nature. In the text is this sort of late modern period, skills that have always been around, but particularly get honed and become their own sort of thing of a more literary and narrative critical kind of reading, which is my inclination very much. And then in front of the text I break that into 2 different kind of categories. One is ones that are sort of in front of the text, meaning after the text's production and how that can be helpful, particularly history of interpretation and or reception history, which aren't quite exactly the same thing, but mean ways in which the text has been received and interpreted. Those can be really, really helpful for us to get over our chronological snobbery and to see how different people have read the text. And then a day's never wasted if you can use a German word, like my uncle used to say. So you've got Wirkungsgeschichte, which means the history of the effects, recognizing very similarly that we all stand in a tradition of textual reading, and that affects us, whether it's a Latin American reading or a 15th century Chinese reading or a 21st century American reading, Protestant versus Catholic. All of those readings affect us, and that's important to understand. Doesn't mean we can't understand the Bible. It just means that the questions we ask are influenced by our tradition, and that's okay. And Wirkungsgeschichte also particularly means the history of the effects of the text beyond just literary. So thinking about how Johann Sebastian Bach uses Matthew's text as for his St. Matthew's Passion oratorio, and that is an interpretation of Matthew that actually gives us some insight. It can be very helpful. Or I spend a lot of time with sacred art, and whenever I go into any city, I try to make sure I go to the art museum. My wife and I do, and my wife's an artist, and so we talk a lot about art, and thinking about how different paintings or mosaics depict stories from the Bible. That's a kind of interpretation that's no less or more of an interpretation than a sermon or a commentary. And so those are all very important things. And then another kind of in front of the text reading would be biblical theological readings, putting the whole Bible together, themes throughout, and redemptive historical readings, more theological or doctrinal readings, Trinitarian readings, soteriological readings, reading within an awareness of the regula fide, or the rule of faith, that those orthodox doctrinal positions and confessions help us read Scripture well. Scripture is its norming norm. It is the authority, but we need help to read Scripture a lot of times. And because as the fathers pointed out, the heretics, the Arians and others, read the very same Bible that we do. So we need more than just Bible verses. We need a frame to understand what the Bible's about that comes from years of faithful apostles witnessing to it and reflecting on it. And the idea of intertextuality as well, how texts pick up and use other texts. So you've got all that in the book, and I try to discuss it there. The big point is this, that there are many different ways of reading texts, and that the way to get at that is to recognize that the questions we ask of a text are the kind of answers we'll get. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that a text just means anything, as I think I make very clear in the book. A text, there are a lot of bad readings of text, but the point is we don't need to limit ourselves to asking only literary questions or only biblical theology questions or only historical questions, and within historical, just redactional versus grammatical historical or verbal, Greek verbal questions, whatever it is. The kind of questions we ask are the kind of questions or answers we'll get. And to encourage us to be thoughtful, engaged observers who are asking all kinds of questions and recognizing that a rich, full reading of the Gospels or all of Scripture will come by asking all different kinds of questions. So texts are rich, texts are beautiful, and especially when we talk about Holy Scripture, God-breathed, inspired, inerrant texts are speaking many, many different things. They're like a hot piece of metal that when you strike it with different questions, it sparks off in a million different directions. Not, again, meaning that a text doesn't have a meaning, but meaning that the way you approach it, the experience of reading, is properly asking particular questions and then getting particular answers, all within the singular authoritative meaning. So that's the big idea of this. And the only other thing to say, and that goes into chapter 7 then as well, and I talk about this of meaning and the role of the reader and objectivity, and particularly the meaning and application idea. And I'd be very happy to say not everyone agrees with me on that. I'm more on the John Frame, Kevin Van Hooser kind of side of that. But there are other people that read it differently and don't like that kind of way of talking about meaning application. And I can acknowledge the benefit of thinking of meaning, application, significance versus meaning in the way I'm talking about it here. Either way, I think we end up at the same place, because the point is that the texts do speak, especially when you talk about Holy Scripture, that God is speaking to us. I'm just trying to provide a different theoretical framework that I think gets us a little farther along in interpretation, but I'm not going to die on that hill, and I can recognize there are different opinions. So you can wrestle with what I've said there in chapter 7. We can talk about it in other formats as well. I think at the end of the day, we're not in such a different place, but I think those are different ways of constructing what's happening. Final thing I'll say for this portion of the Hermeneutics 501, there'll be others as well, is to just bring up the idea of one of my favorite authors and thinkers, a man by the name of Umberto Eco, a famous Italian philosopher and semiotician and novelist, wrote hundreds of novels or tons of novels, et cetera, E-C-O, Eco. And there's a lot that we could say about Eco. He's very prolific, wrote over the course of many decades. But the main idea I want to mention from him that he provides for us in hermeneutical terms is the idea of the encyclopedic context. And very briefly, what he means by that is that a good reader of any text, and we'll talk about the Gospels here, a good reader of any text is one who is going to try to approximate understanding what the evocations of the text would have been in its original context. Okay? And it's slightly different than just an historical critical reading, although it has some overlap. There are some sort of epistemological differences and some hermeneutical differences. But the point for us is that a model reader, as he talks about it, a model reader is one who is paying attention to the evocations of the text in its original cultural context, recognizing that words don't just mean something in a kind of steel box objective way, but words are evocative, words are powerful, words are signs. And so when Matthew is saying something about the word righteousness, for example, or the Jews, or whatever it is, in his own context, that has evocations of all sorts. And the best reading of Holy Scripture is going to be one that pays attention through study over time and time again to hear those same evocations, to pay attention to them, to circle in what's called the hermeneutical spiral towards more and more understanding of that. And so, again, there's much more to say. That's a super simple version. There's a lot more that's going on in Eco. But I just want to put that idea before you as well to recognize the idea, and I'll come back to this actually in a later lecture, about the idea of the model or implied reader. The one who is the best reader of Scripture is one who is seeking to hear the voice of the text by paying attention to the signs and evocations that it's giving. All right, so I think that's all I'll say for now in this, and we'll come back with some other discussions of Hermeneutical 501.